Good evening, everyone. This is another Wednesday evening conversation with Ajahn Nisabho and myself for the Clear Mountain community. So this is the first time we've been together since, I think, January or December.
In this room.
In this room, yeah, with this background.
Yes.
For the most part, I've been down in California at the Dharma Buddhist University, and we've been having these, I think, once a month conversations. And our themes are usually something in the format of finding X in Y, like finding seclusion in company or finding retreat when in community or this type of thing. And our topic for this evening is finding the Dhamma in poetry. And I think we picked that. I think that was your choice.
I was leaning art and poetry, and we decided it was too broad, so wisely narrowed it down.
Yeah, and this is one which I think I'm going to take a more of a interviewing type role for the most part, just since, poetry is something which I and I think many people just don't necessarily get. Whereas other people, like I think you would fall into this category as people who just feel called both to write poetry and to appreciate poetry for itself. And there's lots of things we can look at in this overlap between poetry and Dhamma, finding the Dhamma in poetry or finding poetry in the Dhamma, a poetic approach to Dhamma. And do you have any thoughts of direction that you might see this conversation going?
I remember Longpor Pasano said that we were asking about poetry and like his take on it, and he's like, I just say it. I think he didn't quite like poetry that much, at least as far as I know. So he might fall into that same category you just put yourself in. I mean, I'd be happy to share some of my own views, but we were speaking a bit about some of the research you did ahead of time, and I think there's I'd be very interested in the threads you came across within the suttas as well. So, yeah, certainly.
Well, yeah, maybe, I mean, from my approach, basically my relationship with the overlap between poetry and Dhamma is much more on the kind of Pali Dhamma side of things. I mean, I didn't really appreciate poetry. I didn't read poetry. I'm pretty sure I've never bought a book on poetry, unless you consider like the Tao Te Ching, which, I guess that is poetry before ordaining. But there's poetry in the Pali Canon, and it's interesting to look at how that manifests and how it might be different from poetry in other contexts. I mean, there's poetry in the Bible as well, but the Buddha has said that he would never say anything which was untrue or unbeneficial or untimely. So it's interesting to look for the truth in this. In the quote you had from Lumpur Pasano, in that just say it. Implying that poetry might be kind of beating around the bush or conveying things in this kind of roundabout way, but the Buddha didn't mince words, so obviously he did find many occasions for giving versified poetry. In the Pali is called gatha, Gatha, and you find these versified poems all throughout every book you find it in the Vinaya Pitaka, and you find it in every book of the Sutta Pitaka. So there's poetry in the long discourses, in the medium discourses, in the collected discourses, the whole first section of which is called Sagatha, or with verses. So the first, I think 7 or so.
Those are largely with the connected discourses, you're saying, partially? Was that what you're naming, or the
yes, connected?
Yes,
If
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
but, I mean, what was interesting about those is that so many of them were in verse, like, sorry, with the devas specifically.
Mm,
You know, almost I think I've heard someone say that every interaction with a deva in the Pali Canon is done in poetry, in
mm,
verse. I don't know if that's true,
mm.
but it's interesting if it is.
It is interesting. Yeah,
Mm,
I can't confirm or deny that as
mm,
well, but definitely there's lots of every verse I can think of off the top of my head
mhm,
is certainly in that vein, including like long, what might even be considered like epic poetry, like the
mm,
Atanatiya Sutta it's
mhm,
considered a protective chant in Thailand and in other Buddhist countries. Even that forest meditation masters, Ajahn Mun, had it memorized, and it's basically, I think, in the form of an epic poem given by
mm,
a high up deity, um, yeah, in verse, like praising um, the Buddha and yeah, it's said to give protection in certain ways. But in the same way, I think um, in some of the research that I did trying to figure out poetry before this conversation, came across this reference in this book by someone who's basically looking at the different um, interaction between the Buddha and Mara and finding a similar thing that the Buddha or that Mara, when he appears,
mm.
he largely speaks in verse as well. So this is the tempter figure or the Buddhist devil in a sense. But um,
Well, and he's a high up deva as well, at least in the realms, which is interesting, so
right,
that's fascinating.
and specifically in the realm of the devas who delight in the
Mhm.
creations of others,
He's like a rebel prince in one corner of it, I believe.
a rebel
Yes,
print.
that's what Ajahn Punadhammo said.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Does that
Mm.
mean anything to you? That the fact that it's the devas who delight in the creations of others, um, does that have some kind of resonance with appreciation of poetry? I mean,
No.
no.
No, not necessarily. It's a good question. I mean, if the devas that spoke in verse were constrained to that realm, then maybe I would lead more out of it, but since all the devas from all the realms, as far as I know, speak in verse, then I can't quite nail it down in that way.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, what gets me, you know, what I find very interesting in, the use of poetry in practice is, the fact that I believe it can be used in the service of the first and the third noble truth.
Mm,
So, you know, when people write generally, you can use poetry and writing to metabolize like suffering really effectively. And it's, you know, this is the use of, say, slam poetry or something like that, but also just more restrained versions is there's an ability to shift a narrative and really ennoble, in a sense, some of the tragedy of the world and be able to reframe it in such a way that, you know, you can look clearly at it and reframe it as something quite different than just something that's wrong. And I see that as a really powerful use of poetry. The other is in the service of the third noble truth, and namely how you know, I think the Buddha was very careful with not pointing too explicitly to like what exactly nibbana was in any detail because of the fear that we'd like reify it or
mm,
conceptualize it too much. But so he sort of tipped his hat at it, you know, calling it nibbana and the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion. Um, and you know, I suppose as soon as you conceptualize or speak about peace in that sense, you risk compromising and tainting it.
mm,
Um, Nonetheless, I think that there, for me, have been joyful qualities of heart that feel very, you know, the aspect of beauty, of a certain joy that's been very sustaining on the path. And, uh, you know, for me, when poetry is used to kind of speak to and call out that beauty in the world, not necessarily of I think it probably is of the sensual realm to some extent, but there's a piece, you know, in a lot of our experience, and I feel like beautiful poetry can be used to speak to that more refined aspect of
Mm,
life. And you see this in the great art of Japan, the Tibetan mandalas. Like it would be, I think, quite a leap to say that any of those were adequate portrayals of the enlightened mind, but uh, they are pointing towards something, or they're an expression of some quite uplifted quality of heart,
mm,
and I think that if we don't ever, the Christian monastics manage to keep their monks and nuns often for their whole lives, and they don't have the meditative tools that we have. And I think one of the ways they do that is because most of those monastic forms have some way of artistic expression, either icon painting or singing. We aren't allowed many of these things. But I think we can take note of the sustaining power of those tools. And for me, I found poetry to be like very sustaining in my holy life for this reason. This act of like communion and rejoicing has been important to me. And one thing I stumbled across in your notes for this talk was the term patibana,
mm.
and I'd be curious if you would speak about it, because it's an interesting term and it shows up a lot, and often in the context of um, poetry, and it has to do with this aspect of luminosity or something like that. So, what's your sense of that term, or anything else you feel like talking about in this area?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing about your yeah feeling that poetry can be an outlet, like a suitable and okay outlet for a monk. I mean, we can't sing and
Hmm.
dance. That's the Buddha specifically prohibited those outlets for creative expression. But the Buddha himself, named, he had many uh, disciples who, you know, were perhaps born in a Brahmin sect, and um, grew up memorizing the Vedas, which are pretty much all in verse,
Mm.
and were very skilled in that. And you find that in the teachings of the elder monks and the elder nuns, the Therigatha, and you also find it in its kind of um, most personified form in the person of Vangisa,
Mm.
who the Buddha named foremost in Patibana, or foremost in quick wit, is
Mm.
another translation. And yeah, pati is like back, it's
Mhm.
a backwards movement. So it's this kind of speech that goes back and forth, which is
Mm.
spontaneous and ready
Mm.
wit is another translation for Patibana. And Vangisa, we have poems of his, I think two. There's a Vangisa Sutta, as well as some verses of his in
Mm.
the Therigatha, and the fact that the Buddha would highlight him. He gave,
Mm.
these superlatives, like, they have an American
Mm.
high school as a basically, like, you know, best looking. The Buddha didn't have one of those, I don't think, like sexiest legs or something like that. But he had foremost in wisdom, or foremost in psychic powers, who's Moggallana,
Mm.
foremost in ascetic practices, Mahakassapa, and foremost in Patibana, ready wit. Even some people would translate that as foremost in versified poetry
Mm.
is Vangisa.
I mean, I think one thing that comes up around this Patibana, and I've heard Master Heng Sure translate that as he talks about these different sorts of eloquence, and I know Patibana is quite interesting to try to translate, like quick-wittedness, or I've heard it creativity. I don't know how accurate that is, but this aspect of like exchanging verses back and forth, like it's a very deep part of say Chinese culture. I know Master Hua was a master at it. You come up with four kind of characters in this poetic system and come up with a response to them. I remember how, when we were on Tudong, Ajahn Kovilo and I would often do kind of this back and forth freestyle poetry, and it got us through some pretty, like there was one night where we'd had, I think, way too much, like, someone had just offered sort of food from this gas station, and then we'd walked for a long time, and we were kind of grumpy and tired. I was grumpy, but, and it was dark, and, we went till, like, 9 p.m., but, the poetry or the back and forth really brought out a life, underneath the surface, and I find that's continually the case. One of the things I think is interesting is a power of mindfulness that Nyanaponika, Bhante Nyanaponika, references is tidying up by naming.
Mm,
And I think often, the terms we're referring to in the mind, you can tidy up something quite quickly by saying, oh, this is doubt, this is aversion. But I think there is this sort of substrate to the human spirit, a sort of Jungian dream substrate that sometimes simple terms don't tidy up.
mm,
But what poetry I've seen do is somehow a well-placed metaphor or analogy serves as almost like an initiating crystal, in a saturated solution, and all this sort of random mess begins to crystallize around like a powerful metaphor,
mm,
either dark or light, and it tidies up by naming, but a different strata of the mind.
mm,
Um, and I've just seen this so clearly in myself with, like, deep suffering sometimes. If you write it out, it processes and
mm,
metabolizes in a way it just won't otherwise.
mm,
Um, and I think the Buddha also used this, powerfully in his own some of the analogies he gives are unbelievably elegant and beautiful, and certainly meant to catalyze experience as well.
mm,
His jhana analogies of the lotuses in a pool,
mm,
like blue, white, red. Like, why does he have to put the colors in there?
mm.
But there's this really beautiful image he's painting that's supposed to catalyze an experience of calm and samadhi, I think. And then his image of the enlightened mind as light that lands on nothing. So, anyways, those are some random thoughts, Ajahn.
Yeah, the Buddha was definitely a genius in terms of metaphors and similes and analogies. A good source for those is Access to Insight.
Mm,
There's a whole, you can search by simile. Actually, there's a whole, you just click on simile and it'll take you to a page of um, the similes which are found in the suttas that are translated
hmm,
on that site. So that's a great source for similes. Similarly, Ajahn Chah was a genius of metaphor. And it's interesting. There's an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the
mm,
American transcendentalist, about poetry, and he talks about how even like words, like when things are first named,
mm,
it's like this tidying up, and even
mm,
words, all words, he suggests, were originally poetry, and just tying that back
mm,
into how you're finding poetry, perhaps um, an expression, or um, it has this relationship with the third noble truth. And the
mhm,
Buddha did talk about, he didn't talk about Nibbana that
mhm,
much, but he does talk about the island. He talks
mhm,
about the harbor. He talks about the refuge. He talks about the further shore.
mhm,
There's all these other similes
mm,
and pictures, which are kind of like that super saturated solution.
mm,
The island. I mean, it's enough to,
mm,
just that one word, that one concept, that one image is enough to produce the 300-page book by
mm,
Lumpur Pasano, Ajahn Amaro, just coalescing around that idea. And I can see how, um, yeah, poetry can be a means to relate to and actually see through, actually, even a vipassana practice of the first noble truth of suffering, looking deeply, seeing
mhm.
clearly suffering. But actually, if could you say more about how am I speaking of it correctly, a vehicle for the third noble truth, or how does poetry relate to the third noble truth?
I think for me, it's sort of, uh, I mean, the third noble truth, it's realizing cessation or peace. And this I think it can get a little problematic to talk about because you start, um, flirting with ideas of the transcendent and stuff, and I don't feel comfortable asserting that one can touch that with language, you
Mm,
know? Um, what I have seen is that there's, the noble beings aren't, they let go of suffering, but what they come to in the third noble truth isn't a blank nothingness. There's these qualities of joy. You spoke once about how when Bhikkhu Bodhi and was debating whether to translate nibbana as awakening or enlightenment,
mm,
he went for enlightenment because there's so many metaphors of light.
mm,
So there's this quality of in this third noble truth of light, of joy, of metta, of
mm,
I would say some measure of beauty of some kind.
mm,
And I just find that joyful quality, which is so essential,
mm,
especially in the monastic life in the
mm,
Theravada, where we're so focused on renunciation,
mm,
is just it's made the difference in a lot of I've seen a lot of practitioners and monastics kind of dry up without something like that.
mm,
Um, so I see that as meaningful. However, I also see a difference in how the Buddha used a lot of these metaphors and analogies. Just some of them are very precise, and I do see, he warned against poetry in some of the verses, about how it
mm,
was seductive. And I think that because the West, in some ways, hasn't had a guiding spiritual light for a time,
mm,
it's projected a lot of it's invested its artists and art with a lot of that uh, hope, and
mm,
um, and I think that that's misplaced in that while some artists certainly can point to, are very spiritually accomplished, art in itself doesn't necessarily have to serve the path, and in fact, it can seduce away from the path. So for me, that's always the interesting tension is like, how does one use poetry to uh, metabolize suffering, to um, look to the noble qualities in the heart and the world without becoming lost in it. And that's an interesting tension to navigate,
mm.
you know?
Just before this recording, I had asked you if you had memorized much poetry before you
Mm.
ordained, and you said that you had, and that you had one Mary Oliver poem memorized. Would you be willing to recite that? Sounds like it has a Dhammic overlap, a Dhammic theme.
That is a good example of a poem. I think that's for the path, you know? Um, I think a lot of people will have heard it. I've said it, recited it before, but it's called The Journey. And it says, it begins, one day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, and the wind pried with its fingers at the very foundations. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though you felt the old tug at your ankles, though their melancholy was terrible. It was a late night and wild, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But slowly, as you left their voices behind, there was a new voice that kept oh, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice that kept you company as you that you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. So that was one of my favorite poems. Yeah.
Mm, mm. And do you find, I think I've read other Mary Oliver poetry, or just even like turns of phrase, like
Mhm.
about mindfulness being, do you remember her phrase about mindfulness being like our ever present duty or something like that?
Mm. No, but that's likely. Yeah. Mm.
It's interesting as you're talking, it's striking me that for you,
Mm.
and maybe for others, probably for Vangisa, This is like poetry can be one of these paths to pamoja,
Yes.
one of these paths to gladness. And like you're saying, to live a life of Dhamma, it's not necessarily the case that just reading prose or not reading at all or just meditating all the time is going to do it for everybody all the time, every day. And that having these kurangyu, these other things which the mind can joyfully wrap around and kind of keep you going and keep you enthusiastic. That's kind of beautiful and is something which I hadn't necessarily thought much of before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this, how do you, keep love, in the heart in a really, noble sense, but a joyful sense, like, where does the joy come into the path? Like you said,
Mm,
pamoja, and I think deep samadhi can provide that, I think, but, you know, I don't think that's available to everyone, and even if it was, I still think these other tools of expressing joy and communion, and rejoicing is, like, very important, and you really see this starkly played out in, I feel like, the monastic life where you've cut off so many routes to connection in terms of interpersonal relationships,
mm,
you have some, but not as many, often. And how do you keep the heart from drying up in the midst of that? And, yeah, so for me, that's where writing has come in most,
mm,
and I think I don't know if it has as much for you. You're more of a, it seems like your that bright quality of the mind and heart comes for you from a bit more like, study and working with knowledge. I mean, we've talked about our different Jungian archetypes
mm.
before, but I don't know if you see that, Ajahn.
That's right. Ajahn Nisabho is the lover archetype,
That's
and
true.
I'm the
The
wizard,
magician.
magician,
You like
magician.
knowledge.
Okay, I do, and there is a way. I mean, my poetic bent in Dhamma is basically these days like memorizing Dhammapada,
Mm,
and the Dhammapada itself is poetry. It's written in verse. The Buddha was a genius versifier. I mean, Pali and Sanskrit verse is very, it has this very specific form. I mean, there are different types of meter. But the Buddha, to be able to speak in this way and to give these teachings in this very specific pattern is quite incredible. And
mm.
perhaps I could recite one or
Please,
two.
I would really like that,
Yeah.
Ajahn.
So these might be my favorite Pali sounding verses
Mm,
from the Dhammapada, and I believe they're verses uh, 15, 16, 17,
mm,
or 16, 17, 18, and 19 of the Dhammapada.
mm.
Um, and this will hopefully get everyone who's not yet a polyphile, if you don't yet love Pali, um, and maybe this will get you inclined. So the Pali verse goes, and it's quite fun. So prepare yourselves for joy. Uh, Ida modati pecha modati katapunyo ubayata modati so pamodati disva kama visuddhi matano. Ida sochati pecha sochati papakari ubayata sochati so vihanyati disva kama kileta matano. Ida tapati pecha tapati papakari ubayata tapati papa me katanti tapati bio tapati dugatingato. Ida nandati pecha nandati katapunyo ubayata nandati punyam me katanti nandati bio nandati sugatingato.
Sadhu.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
great.
those are fun.
What do they mean, Ajahn?
Basically, uh, so one sorrows here and one sorrows hereafter. The person who does unwholesome deeds
Mm,
suffers in both places. Uh, they suffer and they lament, thinking about all the bad things
mm,
that they've done. And the opposite, they delight here and they delight hereafter, looking at the good things they've done uh, in both. They delight and they rejoice seeing these good things.
mm.
And then the next verse is similar, but even the final line is quite interesting. It's they uh, suffer thinking, I have done what is poorly done, and then they go to hell. But then the opposite as well. So they rejoice thinking, I've done merit.
Mm,
Punyang me katanti. I've done merit. Um, and they go to heaven.
mm,
They go upwards. And I think that, yeah, in addition to just being fun poetry, the Dhamma in there is quite profound. I mean,
mm.
just emphasizing reflecting on your past deeds. And yeah.
Well, I mean, it speaks to the whole, when you enshrine something in a poem or
Mm,
something, like it really can raise it up and frame it. And,
mm,
so if you
mm,
enshrine these good deeds in this joy in this sort of form,
mm,
it's one way of raising up that good karma as well.
mm.
That's very good poem, Ajahn.
It's a
Well,
good,
well
yeah.
recited. Mm. Do we want to take a question or
Yeah,
see?
let's take some questions. And I think the whole Dhammapada, I mean, pretty much the whole Khuddaka Nikaya
Mm,
is pretty much all verse poetry, and that includes the whole Dhammapada, the whole Therigatha, most of the Idivuddhika Udana,
mm,
and there are recordings of Sri Lankan monks who chant them much better and more beautifully than I do
mm.
online. Do you remember the name of that monk?
The young one who,
Yeah,
oh gosh,
I think
ra
his recordings are available
they
on
are,
Poly Audio.
but I forgot his name.
Me too.
It's the young man who,
Yeah.
when he was like 4, he began to
Oh,
chant.
that's Dhammaruan.
Yeah, Dhammaruan. Who
Dhammaruan.
are you thinking of?
There's like a modern like Thai monk who
Okay.
yeah. But Dhammaruan's also really beautiful.
I thought that the Buddha gave some directives about monastics not engaging in poetry. Is that true? Ajahn?
Uh, that I think what is being referred to there is a quote from what's called the Future Dangers, the Anagata Bhaya, which would be good for us to touch
Mhm,
on. This is Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Fives, verse number 75. And the Buddha says, or excuse 79. So the Buddha says that in the future there will be monks who are undeveloped in body, virtue, and mind and discernment, who will not listen when discourses that are words of the Tathagata, deep, profound, transcendent, connected with shunyata or emptiness, are
mm,
being recited. They will not lend ear, not set their minds on knowing them, will not regard these teachings as worth grasping or mastering, but they will listen when discourses that are literary works, this is kavita,
mm,
the works of poets, elegant in sound, elegant in rhetoric, the work of outsiders, words of disciples are recited.
mm,
And that leads to, that's a danger which the Buddha points to. It's not a specific rule, as we mentioned, like the Buddha did praise Vangisa
mm,
as being the foremost in uh, patibana or quick wit with his verses. But
mm.
what do you think about those verses, or this not those verses, but the this Anguttara Nikaya future dangers quote?
I mean, I remember, it's interesting to what attracted me to Theravada was sort of I've referenced this quote recently where someone says, if you want to get people to, go to sea or go out on a ship, you don't teach them to build the ship and mill the wood, you teach them to love the ocean. Um, but I think we have the opposite problem in our culture. It's like we have all these, odes to the ocean in the sense of, uh, Rumi or, these beautiful descriptions of what it, would be like to be, at peace with the world. I mean, it's so common, it's cliche. What we don't have is the, very precise instructions on how you mill the wood and raise the rigging and get the ship out of, unbeached from the shore. And I think that's where the Buddha, and the suttas are just so powerfully unique in that, you maybe the lists seem a little off-putting at first, but after you memorize them and take them in year after year, they really do sink and impact you a great deal, and so I think I understand what he's referring to in terms of that seduction of the beautiful language, and I understand how that catches people's gaze very easily away from, if you read the suttas, often they are slightly repetitive. Often you feel like you've gotten what you need to get out of them quite quickly, even if you have not. And yeah, it's easy for the poetry to steal the attention away from where it deserves to be, I think.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
That's another thing in the Vinaya. Two other points which might be related to this. One
Mm.
is that the Buddha said that the Dhamma shouldn't be put into uh, something like Savabhasa, like
I think there's over here.
one's own language, which is sometimes translated as Sanskrit, so shouldn't be put into to verse. Another one are the five dangers of
Mm.
chanting
Too
with
beautifully.
too beautifully, like
Mm.
with drawn out syllables, and it. Some of the dangers are that you become intoxicated by your own voice, like
Mm.
and you don't pay attention to the meaning. Other people get intoxicated by the sound of your voice,
Mhm.
and they don't practice the Dhamma, and it's a bad example for future generations. Um, but yeah, I think like certainly on an individual level, um, finding inspiration where you can,
Mm.
and not everyone um, is always inspired by the prose of the Pali Canon. Um, so I think there is a place for other sources of
Mm.
inspiration, and the Buddha didn't explicitly prohibit it, and he did engage in poetry, as we've mentioned, the
Mhm.
whole Dhammapada, Iddhivudika, Udana, uh, yeah, Sutta Nipata, much of it.
Yeah, I mean, in the verses of the elder nuns and monks were like such a unique body in that it was these aristocratically trained like nobles who were going out in the woods and suddenly writing about it or composing verses. And um, is your sense like my sense is that the oldest strata of the suttas often are in verse, like some of the Kanika or um, Khuddaka Nikaya, um, where he's there seems to be a very particular quality to those suttas, in a way you don't always find in the Majjhima Nikaya and such. Have you sensed that kind of distinction as well at all, or
Well, I mean, I think like most scholars believe that is that yeah, the Sutta Nipata, especially the Atthakavagga,
Mm,
or yeah, Atthakavagga and the Parayana
mm,
Vagga are really the oldest strata because they have this very, the meter of the poetry suggests that it's an older level. And yeah, in the Majjhima Digha, Samyutta, Anguttara, the prose, it's not even purporting to be, word of the
mm,
Buddha. It's like a narrative, once that's what I heard once the Blessed One was staying in. That's all like backstory.
mm,
And if you had a red letter version of the Tipitaka, like a
mm,
red letter version of the Bible is just Jesus's words in red. If you had a red letter version of um, the Anguttara Majjhima or the Majjhima Digha, yeah, it certainly wouldn't be the whole thing in red. Um,
mhm,
but yeah, I mean, it. I understand what scholars are pointing to, that
mm,
these old strata of poetry suggest, a spontaneity of teachings. They're also very non-dogmatic, especially the ones in the Sutta Nipata.
mm,
Um, but that said, I don't totally buy that. Like some scholars go so far as to say that uh, the more codified teachings,
mm,
where yeah, even Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Paths, Seven Factors of Awakening, Five Strengths, Five uh, Effort, Four Efforts, etc., are later because it's too systematized, and the
mm,
Buddha wouldn't have been so methodical. He was more spontaneous. I don't buy that either. It makes a lot of sense for memorization purposes to
mm,
put things in prose and put things in lists, as you were saying, because it's easier to memorize. Like the verse stuff um, is easy to memorize because it is within
mhm,
the meter,
mhm,
and it there's a bump, a bump, a bump, a bump sometimes.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, it's all different. Every line is different. Whereas you memorize these different lists. Yeah, it makes sense that the Buddha would teach that way too, because they're easier to memorize because they just occur again and again, and they form these puzzle pieces, these pericope stock phrases,
mm,
which you can just slide in again here and there, which for all the beauty of poetry. Um, yeah, m- not every form of it has that repetition.
Mhm.
That said, some does, and that's another aspect of beauty of poetry. The rhinoceros horn,
Mm.
the "Wander alone like a rhinoceros" is the last verse of
Mm.
this like 40-line poem, so or 40-verse poem. So
That's great.
yeah, we have more questions.
Maybe. Poetry seems to require intentionality, feel more true, and coming from the conscious mind versus discursive, unwholesome thoughts. The oily voice. Is this skillful reasoning? Does Mara write poems? Hmm. Coming from conscious mind versus discursive, unwholesome thoughts. Ajahn, do you have an answer to this one?
Um, in terms of does Mara write poetry? Um,
He speaks in poetry
yeah, he
often.
speaks in poems, and I think that's one of the amazing factors of any of the. Well, not I'm not praising Mara, but when the Buddha did it, when the Buddha versified, it would have been spontaneous. Um, yeah,
Mhm.
just speaking it, not writing it down or anything. There's not much. There's a lot of evidence that there wasn't,
Mm.
widespread writing at the time of the Buddha. Um, so yeah, and Mara's a god. I don't even know if Mara has hands or paper, much less paper.
It's true.
But,
All right. Ajahn Nisabho, hope you can find some outlets for your natural creativity and bright spirit. Thank you. I have. I have.
he does. He's good. He's good.
Yeah, I found that I did. Yeah, writing poetry is a big help for me. Ajahn, I think this is for you. Could you talk briefly about how you memorize text and when you use or recite it for the practice? I'm currently aspiring to memorize the Sutta Nipata. Thank you.
Wow, that's if you're memorizing the Sutta Nipata, I might suggest maybe starting. Well, I don't know where you're at, but many of the parittas or the most well-known verses are in the Sutta Nipata, the Mangala Sutta, the Karaniya Metta Sutta, not the Ratana Sutta, but the
Mm.
Mangala Sutta, Karaniya Metta. If you haven't done much memorization before, you should memorize those. They're very memorizable in Pali and English. I wrote an essay which is on our website called "A Fun Way to Memorize Long Dhamma," with special emphasis on the Dhammapada, which I kind of went through all the different tricks and techniques I used. But in terms of basically making the Dhamma a poetic take on Dhamma, um, that is basically bringing the Dhamma into the present moment,
Mm.
is is a practice that I do. I mean, that's these days, um, as I'm going back to rememorize the Dhammapada, uh, yeah, finding that the only way it can grab my attention, because before I just memorized it rotely. I had this
Mm.
plan, I'm going to memorize it in 2 years, which is a long time, but uh, basically just getting involved with every single word and figuring out, okay, what does this word manopu bangama dhamma, so mind proceeds, or phenomenon are all preceded by the mind. What does that mean? Or this ida sochati, one suffers here. What is the suffering in the present moment and how am
Mm.
I causing it? Basically, yeah, taking every word almost as a koan, brings it, makes the poetry alive, makes the poetry Dhamma, and makes the Dhamma poetry.
Mm.
Um,
Thank you, Ajahn. It's that article is really worth reading. It's one of the ones that was hugely helpful.
One other way that Tanisbo stays bright is by encouraging other people in their brightness, which he got me to write that article, actually.
It was a good one. It's worth reading and taking up the task of memorizing those verses. The like when you memorize these texts, they sink in a different way than if you just read them. It's completely different. Ajahn Kovilo, how much of the Dhammapada have you been able to memorize? How do you know if you're learning the correct pronunciation? Is a recording? We may have to go about now to Zoom, but perhaps an answer I can name a random verse and see if it would.
I'm up to 100. I've memorized the whole thing, but I've then forgotten most of the whole
Someone in the
thing.
chat, name a number between 1 and
135.
1 and 135, and that will be how we end this session, is by seeing Ajahn
Oh,
Kovilo.
this is gonna be. Oh, it's not embarrassing. Or you
Sorry.
can name one.
Okay,
Okay,
67.
67. Okay. Natang kamang katang sadhu yang katwa anutapati yasa patitos yasa asumuko rodang vipakang patisevati. So that comma is not well done, which when you do it, you have tearful face. Yeah.
Sadhu Ajahn.
Is that right? I think
It's like
that's right. Yeah.
3 more people typed in, but we'll call it "We Have to Go." If you want to hear Ajahn Kovilo recite some more, I'll do it on Zoom. So thank you, Ajahn.
Thank you, Ajahn.
We now have our usual Zoom session, which will be from 6:45 until 7:30. I've pasted the code into the chat, and you can also find it halfway down our website, clearmountainmonastery.org. So we hope to see you soon.